Yeah, incidentally, there are a lot of like Christian gun rights advocates. They say it's not guns that
kill
commit.
people kill people. Do we even need to finish the parallel?
Basically. Now think about this. He doesn't want you to think you can take credit, but then he doesn't really want the credit either.
He does though.
No.
I'm swinging the axe.
I want the credit, but I don't want you to say there's some unique separation of blame from credit that exists nowhere in life outside of this.
Outside of God.
There we go.
Years ago, before the racketeering laws, and I think Shanley will bear me out, guy gets convicted, he gets 10 years, 15 years, he makes parole, he does 7, 8, 9. Anybody can do that kind of time. Everybody did that kind of time. But when you change the playing field to where you bring in a law like the RICO Act, that's very hard to defend.
RICO basically makes it a crime to have a crime business. So I can go rob a bank, that's a crime. You and I could agree to go rob a bank, that's a conspiracy. We give an extra penalty to this. But suppose we agree that for the next 20 years we're going to rob 5 banks a year. Now we've established a RICO enterprise. We've established an informal business to commit crime.
We should admit there's a mafia. Because belonging to an organization, as long as you put it forward, like the Ku Klux Klan and so many other different weird organizations, it's not illegal. It's your actions that are illegal within that group. We could say that all of the old timers who are bosses and admit he's a boss, he's an underboss, he's this, but we don't do anything wrong. And we're good guys. Now you've got to prove that he did something personally, not just this RICO law that they invented and everybody can get caught.
Jay Witt, you wanted to begin with this video. Why? What does this have to do with why we're here today?
So for one, we want the audience to recognize Michael Franzese as our God-like figure here when he's talking, and he's talking about how things were basically smooth sailing for the criminal enterprise until they introduced these RICO laws, and suddenly you couldn't get away. And I guess the analogy for today would be, well, there was a time when the explanations, the distancing of himself from the crime by the use of surrogates, etc., his minions, other angels, other nations to do his bidding, seemed like sufficient enough distance to relieve him of culpability. And him being Yahweh here, or God, or so what we're presenting people with is we're saying that Michael Franzese is more or less voicing the case. He's expressing the condition or the situation that God is in now. That this RICO case that the team is putting together is now that we're putting this RICO case together, he's sort of complaining that it was good back in the old days when I could just kind of get away with just throwing an angel at him as a surrogate, and now they're trying to hit us with some serious time.
Okay, so basically, what you're saying is, it used to be that someone could commit a crime. A low-level guy could commit a crime, and only that low-level guy would be convicted of the crime. But under this idea of a RICO case, that low-level guy, if he can be connected to a crime syndicate, a crime organization, then it's not just the low-level guys. Now the guys at the top who basically gave the green light or commissioned the low-level guy to do the job, that guy can now the guys at the top are now being convicted of the same crimes as the guys at the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So basically what we're going to do here today is we're actually going to try to see if we can take that principle and basically bring the God of the Bible up on charges for crimes against humanity. Could we actually prosecute a RICO case against Yahweh?
Yeah, I think we got a pretty good case. What do you say, Al?
Yeah. It's never been done before.
Yeah, we'll have to aggregate the evidence for sure.
Yeah,
Let's see
I think
what we
there's
can
plenty of
bring back.
evidence here. So we're going to run through some of it. But yeah, let's do that. Let's look at one particular case that might open this door.
All right, this is Romans 9, chapter 9, verse 14 through 18. So, what shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion.
Hold on. just right there alone, he starts off right in our ballpark. Is there injustice on God's part? Is God a criminal, basically? And here we are saying there's a legal standing here to be able to say there's some injustice going on. But also, Pete, y'all tell me if you think I'm tripping here. That's kind of mob talk. Like, I'll have mercy on who I have mercy.
Yeah.
You know, like I'll have compassion on who I have compassion. Like it's kind of like big boss talk right there.
Yeah. And I think it's worth noting that when a thing is above ground, it's not under the table, you usually don't lead with, well, what are you going to say here? Is there injustice here? I mean, it almost assumes that what you've set up as a premise, one might respond to and say, wait a second, that's not fair.
Right.
A lot of times when that's
You're
happening,
anticipating, and that's what Paul is doing here. He's anticipating the charge of injustice against God.
which typically, we can't say across the board. This doesn't mean that he's actually guilty of injustice, but typically when that question starts being asked is because whatever the scenario is that people are being presented with is quite, there's a certain kind of obvious unfairness in whatever is being stated that might lead a person to ask that question.
And, I would point out, just for the audience, perspective, like we are kind of bringing this argument, we're kind of taking it out of the context of Romans 9, I would say, but it still applies in by principle. The context of like what is, when Jewish people at the time are saying, well, what happens to God's promises, right, in this scheme? But the principle is the same, essentially. That's what we're trying to argue.
And Jay Witt used the term, the attempt to clear God. I think there are a lot of people who are watching who they're going to probably take that position of, well, I can clear God of these charges. So if you're watching, maybe that can be, your interest in this is we'll raise the charges. We'll try to put this case together.
Yeah.
And you see if you can clear God of these charges.
So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whoever he wills.
This is the famous passage where people try to say, that's a Calvinist understanding of things. But we're not quoting Calvin here. This is Paul. And he goes on to say, the question of why would somebody find fault in God then if God hardens Pharaoh's heart? Somebody can say, well, Pharaoh hardened his heart first. Yeah, but then God adds an extra coat of hardening here. I raised you up for this purpose. So whether or not Pharaoh hardened his own heart, God says, I raised you up for this purpose, and I hardened his heart. And I'm going to have mercy on who I will. Why do you find fault? And then Paul's answer is, can the pot say to the potter, why did you mold me like this? So who's at fault here?
The whole point of this presentation is that there is a greater will that is more or less upending the lesser will here. So, and that's why the question then becomes, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? The idea is that you have this sovereign entity that is imposing his will on the not so sovereign entity. And then the question is but who are you? That the answer that Paul gives is not to try to resolve it, because you have what we have. You have what logicians call the law of non-contradiction, and you can't have two things be simultaneous. So, without getting too in depth here, just understanding that culpability, it has everything to do with one's power and one's ability to make choices.
It's almost like Jesus, right? When Jesus says, the guy wants Jesus to come heal, so when Jesus heals, I'll come with you. The guy says, no, 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 no. I know how power works. I'm a ruler over a certain amount of people. I just give the word and it happens. If you just give the word, the healing will take place. So this idea of God being behind things and being able to speak and have things happen at his beckoning, like that's not a foreign concept.
So if in this whole entire RICO case and the whole idea of a RICO case is based in the concept of culpability, that a person who hasn't literally done something can still be culpable if they're the cause of it. So here, the same thing applies. You have a person whose will is being overridden by the will of a greater sovereign, and then the question is, how is the person who's the lesser will still culpable? And what you see here isn't a synthesis, isn't an attempt at making a logical resolution, isn't an attempt at avoiding contradiction. What you see here is mob boss language. Who are you? Who do you think you are to ask, this question? Who are you? Who do you think you are to use your brain to try to think your way through this? This is exactly. The answer in some says thinking stops here, because if you're stopping questioning here, you're also stopping thought here.
So I think what's also interesting, because this kind of harkens back. I don't know. We've all kind of grown up with maybe authoritarian parents, maybe that kind of parenting. But we've been in
Do
those.
as I say, not as I do.
Yeah. But more importantly, you've been in those scenarios where, let's say your parent, mom or dad, want you to do X, Y, and Z, and you're just like, wait, but how can we because of X, Y, and Z? And then you kind of go back and forth, and all of a sudden it just becomes, their voice just trumps you. And
I'm the parent,
and you do as I say, or et cetera, or that not. But you would also think that in some way, because theologians or apologists might answer this in some kind of paradoxical way, that there's some kind of and the Bible doesn't actually give you a paradoxical response at all. Like there's no paradox being mentioned.
It does give you a paradox in this sense. It says two contrary things and doesn't resolve them without admitting there's a paradox.
Right.
You know what I mean? I'm trying to think, are there passages that come close to admitting the paradox?
No.
I don't think it does.
I think here in Romans 9 what we see is he just tells you to stop asking questions at that point. He's like, this is where, look, you're the clay, he's the potter. Right. That's not an attempt at providing you with an actual an answer that is intellectually satisfying. It's an attempt at just shutting you up. It's just the same thing that happens at the end of Job.
As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. Does that speak to this idea of the paradox? Like, I won't call it a paradox. I'll just call it a higher logic.
Well, I think the text they go out of their way in the text to explain why we are in the conundrum we're in, why we are guilty. They give us all kinds of stories. They show, Paul says in 1 Corinthians, I think it's in 11, doth not nature itself show you that if a man have long hair, it's a shame. They are appealing to us to think, to establish certain paradigms, certain truths. So it's not as though, I guess if that were the way the game was played from the door, where it's just like, I'm saying this, I don't actually have to explain to you why this is the case. You're to believe this.
Gotcha.
You wouldn't run into a situation when someone says, well, that's not fair. I have a little son, and if I change something I say, if I say, hey, you'll be able to have such and such sweets at such and such a time if you do this reading. If I change it, his natural reaction, just like any human being, is, hey, that's not fair.
Right.
And there's a sense in which, the writers of these scriptures have put us in that same position. Or that you tell us, okay, you're culpable because you did this and this, and then you tell us, oh, well, I actually made him do that. And then the person says, okay, well, hold up. We sound like a little kid, That's not fair. Like, why? How can you?
And rather than explain, it's who are you to ask?
It's like, who are you to ask? I'm the parent. Either you do this or you're going to get punished or something, All right.
So with that in mind, I guess we can now look at this idea of compatibilism more closely.
Last time we learned about the principle of alternate possibilities and the long-standing belief that in order for an action to be free, an agent has to have been able to do something other than what they've done. But contemporary American philosopher Harry Frankfurt challenges this idea by arguing that an agent could, in some cases, be morally responsible for things he does, even when he couldn't have done otherwise. Frankfurt cases play on an intuition that many of us share, the idea that you're responsible for actions you've chosen, and your choice needs to come from within yourself, rather than from outside factors. But it's unclear whether we can actually separate internal factors from external ones. Many think these kinds of examples reveal deep problems with compatibilism. If we can't separate internal and external causes, maybe the answer is to simply say that actions are more or less free, and how free they are depends on how many internal factors are influencing us, and how many external, and how much control we really have over what we do.
So basically, this is a philosophical breakdown of the problems with the idea of compatibilism. Is someone to blame, at fault, if their free will is in some way, shape, or form minimized? And I like what he says here. He says it depends on how free the person's will is. And so I think in the discussion that we're going to have, the question that we can be asking is, how free are the individuals in these cases?
Mm-hmm. And this is maybe we have to rest here for a little and establish a couple things, because they like to use, when I say they, I say Christians and religious people in general, when they run into these contradictions, these things that if you lay them out as an equation on a board, you can't make them make sense logically. What they do is there is the all-purpose term mystery that is slapped on top of that. Not like if you put it in an equation on a chalkboard, you don't, when you press equal, you don't get a situation where God is not guilty. And the way they handle that typically is to use the mystery band-aid, or to just, which doesn't, it's almost like you go in the person's bathroom and they have a window that's near their shower, and the shower window is foggy or is somehow distorted so that you can't see what's going on. It's not saying that it's not actually going on there. They're keeping you from that perspicuous view of what's going on, you know? So I feel like mystery does that. It doesn't say that clearly we see where everything is heading. We see that there's going to be a terminal point where both the guilt of the human being and God are going to collide, and that's basically going to mean God's guilty. But before you get there, they put this window up, and it's just blurry like in a shower or something, and they just say the mystery functions as that window. You can't see anything past it. You kind of know what's going on behind you. You know ultimately God's guilty. But by putting mystery up, we say that's where we stop the conversation.
We see dimly. As through a glass.
Yes, as
when we get behind the glass, we might
he's there naked taking a shower. He's behind there. He's naked taking a shower. It's just all, it's like the mystery will suffice,
So before we get into some of the biblical data that we're going to try to use to build this case, I think we have a theological explanation of compatibilism, and I'm not sure if I remember correctly here, but I think that he's going to try to explain how it's not a problem.
Right.
Yeah. All right.
Well, he doesn't really, from what I recall from the video, he just says this is what the Bible teaches.
Okay.
Sort of like thus says the Lord.
Gotcha.
And that's something that.
So once again, not admitting the paradox,
Not admit.
but presenting paradoxical information.
Yes. And you have to, and at the heart of all of this is a Lord that is declared to be Lord in the text, who refuses to resolve these issues, but then you use that authority. It's an appeal to authority. You say, thus is the Lord. This is what. That's where it stops. The conversation stops here. Why? Because the Lord has said it. Well, how do we know he's the Lord? From the text. The same text that presents us with this conundrum. You see what I mean? But so it's like it ends up being a circular argument. You can't get out of it, essentially. Yeah.
Rhetorical question after rhetorical question after rhetorical question. None of them answering Job's questions. But Job seems to get the point. He says, I'm sorry, I spoke too soon. I get the point. I have lots of things I don't understand. I'm acting as if I do. I repent and I'm sorry. And God says, I haven't finished with you yet. I got 2 more chapters of rhetorical questions. Stand up on your feet. Listen up. And at the end of it all, Job does not say, now I understand. He says, I repent. Not, I repent for certain sins that brought this judgment on me in the first place, because that would be going back to the theology of the false counselors. But I repent of ever talking and thinking against you like that. There are just too many things I don't understand.
You know, clearly we have the background, we have the bird's eye view on the whole thing. We know that this was all like a deal between God and the devil, essentially. And when Job, he doesn't say to Job, "Oh well, I sort of had a bet with the devil." He doesn't actually give him that answer. He's just like, "Where were you when I, stretch out Orion in the sky?" Or where
This
were
is
you when I?
what Isaiah says, quoting God. Woe to the Assyrian, the rod of my anger, in whose hand is the club of my wrath. I send him against a godless nation. I dispatch him against a people who anger me, to seize loot and snatch plunder and to trample them down like mud in the streets. So understand, God is using the Assyrians, the most warlike and cruel regional superpower of the day, to crush the covenant people of God. God is using them to trample them down like mud in the streets. That's what the text says. But this is not what he, that is the Assyrian, intends. This is not what he has in mind. His purpose is to destroy, to put an end to many nations. On the basis of the cities I've already crushed, do you really think these new ones can stand up against me? As my hand seized the kingdoms of the idols, kingdoms whose images excelled those of Jerusalem and Samaria, shall I not deal with Jerusalem and her images as I dealt with Samaria and her idols? Isaiah comments, when the Lord has finished all his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the king of Assyria for the willful pride of his heart and the haughty look in his eyes. And God says, does the axe raise itself above the person who swings it, or the saw boast against the one who uses it? That is, if the Assyrians are doing these things, it's because God is using them as a tool.
Hold on, stop it right there. Stop him right there.
That's all we need.
I think he just admitted to the crime. Now, of course, we have to, is it a crime? But he admitted to being behind this act.
Well, it's funny because the parallel is when people say, when gun rights, incidentally, there are a lot of like Christian gun rights advocates. Right. They say it's not guns that kill people.
People kill people. do we even need to finish the parallel?
Basically, it's not them that's doing it, it's God using them to do it,
Here you have God using, he says, the most ruthless group of people in the world, the Assyrians, he's using them to judge God's people, Israel. He's going to trod them down in the street like mud.
And then he's going to judge them.
But hold on, so God's doing this to Israel.
Via the Assyrians.
Via the Assyrians. But here's the interesting thing here. Two things are going on here. One, God is behind it. He's swinging the axe called Assyria to chop Israel down. But then he's going to judge Assyria for chopping Israel down, and it was his hand behind him. But notice why he's going to judge Assyria. Because they thought they did it on their own. It's not because they're so evil or wicked. It's, you thought you could do that by yourself?
Let's pause here for a second and just do like a little thought experiment. So is the implication here that there would have been a humble way to do it where you would escape judgment?
And in which case, God would still be behind it.
Yeah. So could you have done it and been like, I'm kind of doing this?
This is almost like the older drug dealer on the block who puts a younger drug dealer on.
Yeah.
Or an older mob boss who sees a young guy, I made you.
Yeah.
I made you a good fella, right? I made you, and now you think you made yourself. Now because you got your cars and you got your girls and you got your spots that you run, you forget that I made you.
Yeah.
Like, this is mob talk.
Yeah. it's an ego trip. Like, literally, it's ego tripping.
When it was playing, you said ego, and I was wondering, like, are you talking about the king of Assyria or God?
Oh my God.
Okay.
The answer is yes. It's like, are you talking about it? Hey, yes. Yes. They're both, the egos of both are competing. It's like seeing two egotistical people, like, bumping chest against each other. You know what I mean? Like, he's like, I ultimately don't think that. Now, think about this. He doesn't want you to think you can take credit, but then he doesn't really want the credit either.
He does, though.
No.
I'm swinging the axe.
I want the credit, but
I don't want the blame.
There's some unique separation of blame from credit that exists nowhere in life outside of this.
Outside of God.
Outside of this.
That's one of the privileges of being God. You get all the credit and none of the blame.
Is that a sin of omission in some sense on God's part? Right? Just because if you just don't talk about it, you know what I mean?
That's ridiculous.
I mean,
And it's like God is doing it, but he's also insisting that he's able to, like a puppeteer, control the way. He's like, all right, I'm doing this, but just in case you think that you can call me guilty of doing something wrong, I get to control, like I get to dictate the nature of the conversation. And the nature of the conversation is one in which all of the guilt is applied to you guys, even though I am insistent on my role in it. But at the same time, you cannot ascribe any of that guilt to me.
And he's only insistent on his role in it when you try to take his glory for the thing that he doesn't want to blame for.
Yeah.
Right? Until you try to take the his shine, he's okay with using you.
Yeah.
But then, if you ever get too big for your britches, no, I'm the one.
Yeah, I'm the one. And it does make because you don't really see people who are really in control. It's just like the centurion that you referred to earlier. He's like, they're sort of calm, cool, and collected usually when you're actually in control.
Right.
It's like you've heard the phrase small man syndrome. You know?
Yeah.
It's like, or Napoleon syndrome. It makes you think, not to be sacrilegious, but it makes you think, if you have this sort of insecurity, what are you insecure about?
Right.
You know, it's like the small dog that's going nuts barking at the big dog. It's like, it usually doesn't happen in reverse. Like the more confidence a person has, the less they have to who do you think you are? You know, the less posturing the individual has to do, because they know they can back up whatever they need to back up, you know? So it sounds no, that's not to say it is human, but it sounds shockingly human for people to be talking this way. It sounds like somebody who isn't in control, right? It might give us a clue.
Wow. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say what you're about to say. Finish that.
No.
Okay. You said it might give us a clue as to who's really behind this, right? If it sounds so human that you have to, it's almost like if Israel were to say, okay, Assyria did just beat us in battle. But we've got to find a way to make it look like we only lost because our God was still in control. So we're going to say our God let you beat us. That's one way. We're going to come back to this at the end of this whole process.
You essentially can't. It's literally Trump saying I didn't lose the election. Like, you can't lose. It's saying it's rigged.
Right.
You know, it's
I only lost because
the machines were rigged.
Right.
It's like the only reason why you beat us is because God rigged the game against us to judge us. So then your victory is never a victory.
Right. Well, here's the thing, though. They could get either God has to take the blame, or they have to take responsibility for putting this on God when it wasn't really God.
Yeah.
That's one way to get to clear. If the Christian who's watching saying, can we clear God of these charges? Yes. Then humans have to take the blame.
The humans, yes.
We wrote this. We said this. We did this.
Yes.
Otherwise, we're going to lay this at God's door. We're going to subpoena God.
Yeah. The only problem is that in an attempt to take the W from your enemies, your earthly enemies, you end up implicating your sovereign.
Right. God's on the hook now.
So, and you haven't worked through it much. You basically shut the door. You scream at the person and say, shut up, and shut the door when they're like, yo, but wait a second, this isn't making sense. Wow, shut up. You slam the door in their face. You stop the conversation. You don't really resolve it. And you know, I guess you could say Christians, but a lot of religious people in general are particularly keen on and expert at just shouting people down and slamming the door and saying, okay, conversation is now. Of course, it doesn't sound like shouting you down when you say mystery and you say, well, look, your brain isn't big enough to understand what's going on. But it's like, no, I've been following. I've been following the whole thing.
I think I get it.
I think I understand.
And you have your God on record saying, I'm swinging back.
I don't understand. Like, you're saying there's something I don't understand here. He's taking credit. He's saying that they're doing it. if you keep following these things to a terminal point, they're both guilty. Like,
Whose fingerprints are on the axe?
whose fingerprints are there?
Is it Assyrian?
Exactly.
Is it God's?
Yeah.
Is it the Israelite authors
Absolutely.
trying to make the story up here?
Absolutely.
What's going on here?
Yeah.
That's the question. Now, the verses that we're about to look at, see, this is all right now, we're talking theoretically. Now we're about to actually get into the text and see where the rubber meets the road. All right.
Would we say though that even just the way the Syrians are being treated right now, I mean, is the Bible actually arguing against compatibilism in this completely?
Say more. Like,
So that's what I think. Where D.A. Carson is he's arguing, he's talking, and then he doesn't actually quite understand the implications of what he's talking about.
Well, he goes at 43, 44. I think that's where he gets to the asymmetrical stance behind it. Well,
So-
he doesn't resolve it.
So
but-
the asymmetrical stance, right? That's a claim, but that requires a very technical breakdown of how that happens. You can't just kind of blurt that out and just say, "Oh, okay, we'll accept that because it sounds."
what's the asymmetrical claim for the person who's watching?
Well, the asymmetrical or asymmetrical stance of God behind evil is good and evil is that he stands behind good in such a way that everything that's good can be attributed to him. And he stands behind evil, or asymmetrically in the sense that it cannot be ultimately traced back to him.
Okay, so in this case, would he argue? You think if we were to press D.A. Carson based on how you've understood him,
Yeah.
that if the Assyrians try to take credit and glory for their accomplishments in this role,
Yeah.
would that be a good or bad thing by God's criteria?
Well, according to the text, that's a bad thing, but simultaneously,
But it's justice being brought on upon Israel for their disobedience.
Yeah, his asymmetrical stance behind evil is that it's granted. This is considered a mystery. I should make that clear. How it makes sense, they don't tell you. Again, we constantly using mechanism. They don't actually give you the mechanism by which this. And in any situation that they teach a so-called truth, but don't give you the mechanism by which it is carried out or it is made to be so, is usually labeled a mystery. And so when you have, he says that the Bible teaches this. He doesn't say that I can explain how it works. He says the Bible teaches that God's.
Didn't we just go through this in our previous
It's
podcast
regular, yeah. It's
about inspiration?
yeah, it's the same
Yeah.
thing.
The
The
mechanism.
church has never told us,
Right.
the Bible never tells us how this inspiration happens. It just tells us that it happens.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is why mysteries almost at the heart of everything that you believe in the faith. If you press hard enough, they're not going to try to describe in detail the mechanism of
Right.
it. They're just going to say it's a mystery. I think it's Genesis 50 where Joseph says, Carson quotes it, "You meant it for evil," speaking to his brothers, but God meant it for good. And he's saying in this passage, and he even quotes in Acts, I think it's Acts chapter 3, where there's like the kings of the earth took their stand in it to crucify who you have predestined,
Right.
our Lord, right? So the idea is that the kings of the earth are simultaneously culpable. In the same passage, he's saying that God had predestined this to take place. In Genesis 50, he's saying that your brothers meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. The self-same act was meant for good, that was meant for evil by the. So this is why he says there's this asymmetrical, so that a
But
human.
see, in that case, the humans meant it for evil, but God meant it for
Yeah, exactly. So in these passages, he's saying a human, but the sense of asymmetrical stance behind good and evil. There's a larger principle too, that all that happens, you can attribute all the good back to God. Ultimately, all the evil, it lies somewhere lower than him in a creature. Even if he's sovereign over it, and I think this is where it ties into these passages, because the self same act they could have evil motive for, they can have an evil motive for, but his motivation is ultimately not evil. So that's how they try to clear.
Well, maybe that is a way to clear God, to say God meant to use Assyria for good.
Yeah, I mean that's clearly what they're saying he's doing. Yeah. So, and this is what we call still manning. Like we have to first. We don't want to just come on. Go ahead.
No, so I was just going to say. So here we have Assyria. They God sovereignly moves them like on a chessboard, and we're going to say that that's good, right? God's using them to carry out his will, etc.
Discipline Israel.
To discipline Israel.
Trotting them down in the street
Right.
like mud.
Right.
But the moment Assyrians would say, this was our accomplishment, our doing, etc., then it becomes evil
For them.
for them. But then he judges them. So that's still, all I'm trying to say is that the technicality is not resolved there.
Yeah.
So-
I mean,
so-
there is a sense in which, because he's their sovereign, they couldn't do otherwise. This goes back to the earlier point
Right,
that we
okay.
were making about
Sure,
just the
okay.
freedom of a person's
Yeah,
will.
yeah, yeah.
So, and so that, in fact,
Yeah.
he's using them precisely because they have the kind of arrogant character
Right.
to take it for themselves. You know, that's what.
So if in this case, maybe you can clear God because he meant it for good and never evil.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just say we could do that in this case. Let's see if we can do that in the other cases that we're going to bring up.
Okay, let's
Okay.
bring up some.
All right. So here we go. It's Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 to 14. When you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife.
Okay, stop. I sound like Geno Jennings. But come on here, we got to stop right there. Why in this context? Just stop and think for a second. Why they're talking about a beautiful woman? If you had to attribute these words to someone, what kind of person would you attribute them to? Would you attribute them to a 5-year-old boy? Would you attribute them to a woman in her 40s? Would you attribute them to a woman in her 70s? Would you attribute them to a man?
I would attribute them to a holy God.
Okay, that's great. Now we can continue reading.
Yeah. He wants me to have a beautiful woman.
Okay.
That I'm killing her husband and her.
Ooh, you're getting ahead of us. He didn't present that part yet.
I'm sorry.
All right.
Start over, Al. Let's.
No, continuing, verse 11. And you see verse 12.
No. Just start over.
Okay,
Let's
All
look
right.
at this
And you
now.
see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home.
Again.
Again? Okay.
Why do you desire her take? Is it because she's a P31? Is she a Proverbs 31 woman? Have you examined her character? Do you know that she's this solid person? She's ethical. She knows how to keep on. She's virtuous.
She can buy property. She can work the land. She
Exactly.
Can,
Is it all those things, or is it simply the singular attribute of her being a
Beautiful woman.
Think about it.
Okay. All right. And you bring her home to your house. She shall shave her head and pare her nails. And she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house and lament her father and her mother a full month. After that you may go in to her, and to be her husband.
Hold on, wait. She gets 30 days to mourn the people that birthed her,
That you killed.
raised her, people that birthed her, raised her, nurtured her. She gets 30 days.
Yeah, it's good to pause. I like these pauses because even though it might not make for the most stimulating podcast visuals or audio, the pauses are important because you need to think. Selah, pause here. Think about what you're being presented with. In a current or contemporary court of law, would this strike you as something that is fair? Everybody you know and love was just killed by your enemies, and one of your enemies found you to be attractive and is going to basically rape you, essentially.
No, he's going to marry you.
Yeah. Well,
I'm saying basically rape. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Not rape yet.
Yeah. When I say rape, I'm saying rape by contemporary standards.
And I'm saying, based on the Bible, it's not rape because it's marriage.
Exactly. Because he first marries you and has you shave your head, etc. But he's giving you 30 days to basically where you don't have to undergo him penetrating you and sleeping with you in bed after having killed your family. You got 30 days where you don't have to worry about this man, like,
how merciful,
getting into the bed with you and penetrating you and potentially producing offspring from you.
How merciful is that?
That's
30
mercy.
days. That's the epitome of mercy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Great is God's mercy there.
Praise God's mercy.
Oh, I'm sorry, you were reading.
After that you may go in to her, and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants. But you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her.
You humiliated her by letting
Let
her
it
go,
go.
not by killing her family
Not the first part.
and forcing her to marry you. You've humiliated. So once again, your question I think is a good one. Who would write this? 5-year-old boy, a single woman, a married woman, a man,
An older woman, a grandmother.
a God, a holy God.
Yeah.
Who would write this? Who would command this?
Yes.
What's more likely? Just is it inconceivable that this is another way of putting it. Is it we can start narrowing it down. Is it inconceivable that a 5-year-old wrote this? Yeah, that's pretty inconceivable. I think it's inconceivable that a 12-year-old boy who's not interested in this kind of thing would write this. Is it inconceivable that a grandmother would think this up? Probably not. She's not thinking about beautiful women being taken by warriors. Who's the most likely culprit? Probably like a middle-aged man. So, you know, like, anyway.
But the question that we have is Yahweh behind this? Is Yahweh responsible? Or, first of all, the question is anything wrong happening here? And I think by modern standards, we would say clearly, maybe you can go back and say by their standards, you know, these women, in times of war, these are natural things that happen. These women would become destitute, or these women, like maybe in their culture, like this was a merciful thing to do to women. So at some point, we'd have to first establish, is this wrong? And I can hear the precepts saying, wrong by what standard? Is this wrong? Even by your standard presuppositions, is this wrong? But then if it is wrong, who's responsible? The men who are going to do this, or the one who's giving them this command? Who's responsible for this? Like, who would you say, Alec, is responsible? Is God to blame for giving this command, or the men who carry it out responsible?
I mean, you know, if we're trying to infer what we just described about compatibilism, I think the answer is pretty clear. In some ways, I'm wondering if maybe, you know, you talked about how culturally this might have been merciful, but you can also maybe think about it in some kind of practical sense, right? Because maybe when one culture was to swallow up another, right, one way to kind of reap the benefits is, you know, aside from the raping and pillaging, right, is that, right, maybe there was this benefit, this kind of consensus that, you know, bringing in all of the women that were desirable to you, right, would propagate and multiply, you know, your own culture and your tribe and et cetera, and so that, you know, you would be, you know, it's like this kind of maybe long-term thinking sort of thing, right? But in what sense, like, how would a presuppositionalist even defend that as morality?
I mean, just think about you're only bringing certain women,
right?
So if it is merciful, why not bring all the women,
right?
All the children.
And mind you, presuppositionalists don't tend to. Their goal is not necessarily to make sense of things. Their goal is to cause enough confusion that you can't make sense of anything. Like, so the idea is to say, okay, at least we have a standard of something.
Right.
Which, as you can see, as you start really going through it, some of the ethics that you see unfolding later, like in the epistles, like in Ephesians and so forth, and where they're telling women how to adorn themselves. Don't let it be the outward adornment. I'm not saying this is Ephesians, but I'm saying don't let it be outward adornment, but the inward
right,
and so forth. All of those kind of those values that we say, yo, amen. Even as an atheist, you say, at least I'll say, like, yo, that's dope. Develop your character, right? Well, we see passages like this where it's like, where's the concern for the character of the woman that you're just looking at how beautiful she is to determine whether you're going to marry her, right? And then you're going to take her and you're going to basically rape her, essentially. And then you're going to tell me when I say that's not right, you're going to say, well, where's your standard for? And I'm saying, where's your standard? Because you got this standard here in the New Testament, you got this standard here. Where's the quote unquote standard? It's not quite a ruler if an inch isn't an inch. If it's an inch here, and then there it's 4 inches, or, you know, that's not. I can't use that. That's not a standard.
That's a good point. So I'm looking at verse 10. Even if someone was to say this is Moses talking, not God giving this command. In verse 10, what he's saying here, though, is it's the Lord who gives your enemies into your hand.
Yeah.
So God is in some way, at the very least, responsible for why this situation is happening.
Mm-hmm.
God is giving their enemies into their hand.
And it's funny, when they win, he gave them into their hands. When they lose, so it's either way.
So God's responsible for the outcomes of these wars.
Yeah, either way.
And what happens to these women as a result of the outcome of these wars, I don't know if you could detach God from this, because these commands are coming from at least the man of God, who got his instructions from the very mouth of God, written by the finger of God.
I remember an MC, there was recently a controversy with he was a rapper, a Christian rapper, who was sending lewd pictures to women and stuff, and he got outed and he lost his platform. And I remember a very prominent MC, Christian MC, who I believe has a podcast, saying, Jesus protected women. And when you look at passages like this, you're like, well, that sounds good. It gets all the likes on Twitter.
Beautiful women.
But it's like, here, he's if you want to even call that protection, because she got to sleep with some guy who's like 50 years old,
Exactly,
who just picked her out and spared her, so to speak.
Let's keep it moving.
Yes.
Let's look at Numbers 31, 17, and 18.
Hear ye the word of the Lord.
Now, therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has no.
What's going on here?
Is that the wrong passage?
No. Go back a little bit. Go back to 14. That just is a weird way to break into a Bible text.
Okay. All right, starting from verse 14. And Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of thousands and the commanders of hundreds who had come from service in the war. Moses said to them, have you let all the women live? Behold, these, on Balaam's advice, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor. And so the plague came among the congregation of the Lord. Now, therefore...
So basically what we're going into here is the Israelites went to war, and they let people live that God told them not to let live. God sends a plague, and the plague is decimating Israelites. Okay, here goes the solution.
Now, therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man by lying with him. But all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves.
So God is basically saying, you go to these people, you go against these people in war, don't let any of them live. In this particular instance, this is basically genocide. Kill them all, except for
Virgins.
the women, the virgins.
The virgins.
Keep the virgins alive for yourselves.
Mm-hmm.
This can kind of go back to what we just talked about, like who would write this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just do a thought experiment, real quick one. Let's take a wild guess. That was there women at the heart of this? That could have been. Oh no, let's start at the top of the pyramid. Was it God? I mean, let's present it.
Right.
It could have been God, but God seems to have a very male-ish kind of leaning for sure. I mean,
And a sexually active male.
Yeah, sexually active, because if it's a God with a female sort of leaning, I mean, you would think in terms of equality that there would be more of a focus on the female prisoners for a female leaning God. She would be focused more on the male, like save the Arnold Schwarzeneggers.
Or maybe a compassionate, like, hey, just save all the women.
Yes.
Take care of them.
Yeah, yes.
No, keep the virgins alive.
Yes. But the fact that since there seems to be a sexual selectiveness going on here, if the God had, I could see a lot of Orthodox Christians saying, well, God is, man was made in his image.
Male and female, he made them both.
Yeah, he made them both. But they would say that as a man is the head of every woman, as Christ is the head of the church, they would say that somehow in this hierarchy, man as a male is closer to God,
So think about what's going on
masculine
right now.
pronouns and so forth.
Right now we have Russia invading Ukraine.
Yeah.
And one of the horrors of war is always rape.
Yes.
Because there's lawlessness. There is no 911. There is no... In this time, how much more men are going in and they're raping women. But no, here you keep the young women who have not known men. The ones who have known men sexually.
They're as good as a man in that situation. You know?
But the ones who have not known men, you keep them alive for yourself. I just want people to think about that and just...
And this isn't a thing of the distant past, because even in that book, I think it was Edward Baptist wrote, called The Half Has Never Been Told. It's about American slavery, and he showed how people tend to have a focus on the financial benefit of slavery, but they don't talk about the sexual element of it. And he uncovers what he called, if I'm not mistaken, fancy girls that were in New Orleans, and they typically were what they would call quadroons, I guess, or octoroons, these mulattoes, these people who were part white and black. They had a higher value at the auction block. And he asked questions in the book concerning that. Why is it that they had a higher value? It's because their value was not only in their service, their value was in their sexual slavery. And he shows how that slavery here in America was not just about a fiscal matter, that it often had this component of sexual. And I'm not going to get focused on the Black American experience. This is to say that slavery, anywhere it has ever occurred, has had that element involved, because when you have the ability to determine, for some reason, tends to be men who are in control, and when they have that ability to control over people's lives, this absolute authority over their lives, the sexual element is never divorced from it. And we see it right here in the text. We see it right here. Like, you're keeping certain women as opposed to others. I don't even know if I've thoroughly thought through why you would keep a virgin, but I'm assuming you don't know if a woman is pregnant, if she's in the very early stages of pregnancy, and you want to make sure that your offspring is your offspring.
Yeah,
so
that's part of it.
Yeah, that has to be part of it. It reminds me of like when lions find when they go to a pride and they.
But it's not entirely that. I mean, I hear you, but it's not entirely that, because let's say you have a woman who they have known men.
Okay.
Why couldn't you capture them, keep them long enough to know that they're not pregnant?
Yeah.
And then still, like, no, if you ever known man.
Yes. So there's an element of I want a virgin.
Right.
For the sake that she's a virgin. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah. These are the commands of Moses, and you would I don't know how high up he is close to the boss man, but if these are not just Moses' command, these are God's commands to keep the young virgins for yourself.
Yes. Now, I guess there are two questions here. The one question is this evil? And if it is evil, in light of the present podcast, because this is still a RICO case that we're trying to establish. So first, we have to establish, is it not evil? If it's not evil, then we can't include this in our evidence. Right. So we have to ask the audience, do you think it's evil to capture young teenage girls in war and for the purpose of basically sexual slavery?
Well, hold on, because please remember what you're about to say.
Yeah.
You all pointed something out to me that I'm like, I think we probably need to spend some time talking about this. It's not just keep the young teenage girls, virgins. Kill every male among the little ones.
Yes, the babies. Yes.
Only kill the male babies.
Yeah. So that means when you're looking at the little female baby, what are you
doing with these female babies?
You're looking at their sexual future. Perhaps.
This is a little crazy.
Yeah.
This is a little crazy.
Yeah.
Kill the male babies.
Yeah. Don't do that to the females, because that's...
Keep all the women who have not known men.
Yeah. Yeah.
Every female. Keep them for yourselves.
Yeah.
There is no age limit here. The only age limit is probably the upper age limit, because the older they are, they probably have known a man. The lower age limit, think about this, you're only killing the male babies.
It's really easy to gloss over this. The way
I glossed over it.
The way it's phrased.
Yeah.
Intentionally, probably.
Yeah. And the male. See, he doesn't
Right.
say it positively. He just sort of just kind of it's inferred that
It's inferred.
that the female
Right.
babies get kept.
It's a very careful reading that we're
And if somebody's looking at me saying, "Wait, you never saw that before," I'm looking at them saying, "Wait, you did see this?"
And you let it fly.
This
Yeah.
didn't stop you to say, "Wait, what are they doing with the female baby?"
Yeah. Well, we know what they're doing with the female babies. They're allowing, in the best case scenario, they're allowing them to grow up to later be, sold off or just
Wow.
yeah. It's insanity. It's
Wow.
insanity. So I
So, but to your question, is this evil? Factor that into your equation. Of is this evil?
And so, that was the first question. So we first asked, is it evil? So can we establish that this is evil? I think to a lot of people with contemporary sensibilities, and I know Keller and a lot of people will say, well, there's a continuum of sensibilities and,
Sure.
they change and stuff. But okay, just without having to try to muddy the water anymore, let's just say, based on our sensibilities currently, would this be evil? Most people say this isn't good. I mean, whatever you want to call it, it's not good. And now we have to ask ourselves, who's ultimately culpable? So in this case, it would be the people of God, and they would be in this. The analogy would be they are the hammer or they're the axe in God's hands, and so that God is the person who's okay with little baby girls being kept along.
So the person who would say, no, it's not God, God's not on the hook. Here's how I would say we could put God on the hook for this.
Yeah.
Because Israel went to war, and remember the passage we read before, God gives their enemies into their hands. This is the case where they go to war, they didn't kill all the women.
Yeah.
They let the women live. And Moses doesn't send a plague, God sends a plague, which means God is behind what's happening until they let these women live.
Yeah.
So God sends a plague. The solution is, hey, stop letting these people live, kill them all,
Yeah.
but keep the women for you, and that will stop the plague.
Yeah.
If that stops God's plague by killing all these people but letting the virgins live, that suggests to me that God is behind this. He's okay with this because he'll stop the plague if you just do this.
And it also, it sounds very male and human because it's like you're keeping people of some sexual benefit to yourself. I mean, you're not keeping anyone, generally speaking, that you don't find some benefit in. You're not keeping anyone or anything that's not benefit. You plunder them. You might take their gold and whatever. And anything that's not beneficial to you, you destroy it. So you're not destroying the women who haven't been virgin.
Right.
You're not destroying the virgin women. You're not destroying, but you are destroying.
You're not destroying the infant women.
The infant women. Yeah, we need to keep them because
Because
there's
they're
a sexual.
females, right.
There's apparently a sexual value in these females, but the other individuals are. So it's not an indiscriminate extinguishing of human life. It's the extinguishing of human life that doesn't seem to have a certain kind of value, and in this case, it seems a sexual value is of very seems to have an importance. And
Important to God or important to?
exactly. And then when we use words like attractiveness, you can see because in the other passage they talked about the attractiveness.
Yeah.
So you can see that it literally is. This is not me pushing this onto the text. That literal sexual attractiveness. Can you be aroused by this person? If you can, this person has value. This person's life is spared. Now, is this the same book we want to teach fairness to people from? That I know this is jumping ahead a little, but is this the same book we want to teach being non-partial as they speak in the New Testament? Don't be partial. Paul even says in one passage, he says, if a man comes into your congregation, he has a ring. He talks about the partiality, how he gets a good seat and stuff.
Right.
Now you think about that ethic and then just reverse. Let's come back to the Deuteronomic code and apply that same sort of ethic. You come into this town and suddenly the outward beauty of a woman makes her of more value than the other person. So there's a partiality you could say you almost learn from the text.
Right. Wow.
You kind of glean a certain kind of partiality.
Exactly.
You know? But anyway, we'll stop.
Wow. No, my mind is blown right now. I'm just trying to take it in. That's just.
Yeah, unless you're going to add anything, can we just keep moving? Can we go to another passage?
Yeah, let's do another. Yeah.
Exodus 21, 7 through 11.
When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do all these things for her, she shall go out for nothing, without payment of money.
I tried very hard to not read any sexual connotation into this, and I was not able to keep it out. Not because I was trying to drum up charges against God. I wasn't trying to plant evidence on God, Moses, the Bible, Israel. I just was trying to give it the best read. But I cannot get away from this sounding like sex trafficking. A man sells his daughter as a slave. She doesn't go out as the male slaves do. So what does she do then? Well, whatever she does, she needs to please her master who has designated her for himself. So father sells daughter as slave. Her job is to please her master who's designated her for himself. And if she doesn't please him, he can give her to his son.
That's weird right there, right? Because the best reading that you might give to it is that she could be purely there for all of the responsibilities that women of the household would do. But then the moment that part comes up, then what the hell? What the like what?
But, and here's the thing. If he designates her for his son, he should deal with her as a daughter.
Implying that the other one wasn't dealing with her as a relative.
Exactly.
Right?
Well, a relative, if anything, maybe a wife. Because look, you designated her for your son. Now you have to treat her like a daughter. Typically, it sounds like a daughter-in-law.
Yeah.
And
but you probably have known her on some level, right?
I would imagine
How would
so.
you not? How would she have not pleased you?
I don't. That's what I'm thinking. But for a culture that doesn't want to go into women that are not virgins, how are you taking women that you've gone into sexually and giving them to your son? If you're so concerned about.
So you're saying this is all manual labor? You think?
I don't know. But here's the deal. It says after you designate her for your son, you treat her as a daughter. But then it says if he takes another wife to himself.
Or implying this was sort of like a wife.
Sort of like a wife.
Yeah.
If you take another wife to yourself, you shall not diminish her food, the former servant.
Yeah.
Her food, her clothing, or her marital rights.
Yeah.
So there's something sexual happening here.
And there's this murkiness in these laws because there's even a law somewhere where he says that if a man rapes a woman, he would then have to take her as a wife.
I think we're going there next.
We are?
Yeah.
But hold on, let me make this point here. Because it's almost as though the lawgiver, Yahweh in this case, wouldn't have anticipated that if a man wanted to get with a woman who didn't want to be with him, he could just force himself on her and then she would have to be his wife. You see what I mean? So when you make laws that, this is what we call in modern, I guess you would say contemporary vernacular, we would call that a loophole. Where you set it up as like, all right, generally I ask for her hand in marriage, but how can I get her even if she doesn't want to be with me? Well, if I rape her, then she's forced to marry.
Wow.
And that's a loophole. And it's kind of interesting that.
Well, so the context of this loophole is slavery.
Well,
right.
This is even for Israeli women. Just if you rape a woman, you had to then marry her as a way of almost making it right. And from one perspective, you could read this as many Christians read it and say this is provision for a woman who would essentially be seen as unmarriable from that point. So they see this as mercy and grace.
Right.
But they don't seem to anticipate certain bad actors who might see that and find a loophole for a person who doesn't want to marry them voluntarily.
Right.
So it's like if I rape her, then I'm forced to marry her, which I end up having the same result I wanted either way. I just don't have to get her consent. You see what I'm saying? So that basically what I'm saying is any law that makes it mandatory for you to rape, to marry a person you rape, even if you see it as mercy, it can end up becoming also a loophole for people to force themselves on a woman that doesn't want to be with them.
And I think the reason I bring the slavery thing is because it's another, it's not just a parameter, but it's like another structure that kind of adopts that dynamic that you're talking about. But the slave context becomes this almost container for things that are implied and unspeakable almost, right? Right. When you think about the founding fathers, right, who had slaves, and Thomas Jefferson and all that stuff, and we were supposedly living in some kind of Christian world at the time, quote unquote. But those, even when you have an institution or something like that, right, some kind of system of kind of ownership of a person, then that has all that immorality and ethics being grayed out and completely, so.
Well, it's interesting that we're in the RICO case, because anybody who knows anything about court documents, they know how the jargon gets very, very specific, and to the point of being almost you can't decipher what's going on, but it's for the purpose of very particular language. Yeah. And when you see this, there's a lot of elasticity and a lot of murkiness where, like he said, there's implications by phrases that come later that, okay, this does involve sex, like the wife language later, but it's murky enough where a lot of things can go on. And this is why in our current legal code, you have such specific jargon for very specific things, so that everything has a very clearly defined definition. That's a bit of a talk. Has a definition that's clear and perspicuous. Whereas here, it's almost intentionally, seemingly left vague. So
maybe someone could say it's vague to us. Yeah, exactly. Maybe it was much more clear to them. But what's clear to me is, at least, the man is selling his daughter into slavery, and the slavery involves sex. Yeah. One could say sex slavery. Yeah.
And she's being essentially passed around. Right. Exactly. It's not a mandated passing around.
But she can be.
It's a contingent passing around. Right. If she doesn't please the father, she gets passed on to the son and treated as basically a daughter-in-law. Seems as best we can read it. And it's just like, okay, so she has, whatever you want to say, she has no choice in the matter. However this is, whether it's sex or just doing service around the house, she's a slave. She has no choice. She's being passed around.
This makes me wonder, like, I'll never forget when I was speaking to my mother about David and Bathsheba. Yeah. And I said, I said women liberation theologians, they would look at that and they would charge David with rape. Yeah. And my mother, a devout Christian, she said, "Oh, I've always seen that as a rape." And I said, "Man, as a man, I don't know why I never looked at David and Bathsheba as a rape incident. I have no idea why."
It's almost like we assume she was so willing.
Yeah, like
right.
Everybody wants to get with the king.
Yeah.
But my mom said, "I've always seen it that way." But I just say that to say, when I think about passages like this, I'm like, as a woman, I don't know how you worship this God. You might say, "Oh, well, think about what happened when Jesus came," and Paul says there's neither male nor female in Christ. And, okay, I get you, but when you look at the heart of God in the Old Testament, I have a hard time thinking how you would think this God cares about you as a woman.
Yeah, well, I honestly would chalk a lot of this up to the exchanges people make we make exchanges all day. Every day. There's something that we might give up for something else.
Right. Something that we want.
Something else that we want. And so when people look at the idea of having La La Land, the idea of everything ending happily ever after, the idea of having immortality and bliss, and all of these just ridiculous ideas that, you can't even qualify necessarily or quantify. The idea of giving those things up, if you actually analyze this correctly and recognize it to be as heinous as it is too much for some people to bear. So they will live with what they consider to be the minor inconvenience of these passages. And it's even more of a minor inconvenience if you just don't read them. If you don't focus on them, you don't have to deal with it, but you get all of the other benefits that you get, which is looking forward to seeing that loved one that you want, or just having this great bond in the community. So it's like, what are you saying? I'm supposed to give this up for what? What are you offering me as an alternative? And I'm saying we're offering you reality, however that looks,
and freedom from this kind of ethic.
But I'm not even saying that the life that you're being offered is a better life necessarily. It's just the real life.
Right.
See, that's the thing. A lot of people, they feel like in order to give up this with all of the benefits of this community, I need to have a better alternative. And it's like, that's not the goal here. The goal here is to find out what is true and right and what is the actual case. Now, hopefully that will also have some concord with what is better. But we can't guarantee you that. We can just guarantee you that this right here is not the emanation of a person who's omnibenevolent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
One more. Maybe not one more. I think there's a few we can just kind of speed through these. We'll speed through these, then we'll get to our conclusion. Leviticus 25:44 through 46.
Yep. As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you and their clans that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. This is brutal. You may bequeath them to your sons after you inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brothers, the people of Israel, you shall not rule, one over another ruthlessly.
Pause.
That's the end.
Yeah, you know, you should not rule ruthlessly. It's a comma, right? Comma, but you shall not, right?
Yeah.
One over another.
Yeah.
Ruthlessly,
So whenever you have those commas and a but statement following, the implication is there's something other going on the other side of that comma.
Right.
And I think this is an admission, like you said before, there's an admission of there's something suspect going on here, something you would be guilty of. You know that it's probably not preferable to be owned and to be owned in perpetuity. And that is said, you can do that to the nations around you. This is almost racial.
Yeah.
You can do this to the nations around you and the sojourners who are living in your land.
That's funny.
You can buy them, you can own them, you can give them to your children as a possession forever. But like you said, but don't do that to the Israelites.
And interestingly enough, our Muslim brothers and sisters picked up on the same ethic. So it didn't just end here. And this in the transatlantic slave trade that ravaged Western and Central Africa, it was based on the same ethic. The ethic was you can't enslave. You only could enslave infidels. You couldn't enslave other Muslims. So what they did is it was like, all right, bet I can't enslave my brethren. Okay, I got to go to find some other people who are not. So it leads you to other areas of the world where there are less Muslims. Where would you find them? You find them in West Africa. You find them, and interestingly enough, there's a lot of Muslims in West Africa now. A lot of Muslims over there. Why? Because if you were a Muslim, you can't be enslaved.
Yeah.
So that the edict that you can't enslave your brothers ends up driving many proselytes in West Africa.
Can this go back to what we said earlier, that the people might have meant it for evil to enslave, but God might have meant it for good. In other words,
to spread the religion.
Right. If I could spread, if people become Christians or become Jews or become whatever they become, they won't have to be. They can't be slaves.
Yeah.
And God meant it for that kind of good.
Yeah, but on some sort of base level, this just says better you than me. You know, on some base level, you see this all the time. You see it in America. It's like, where are we going to put the dump? You have a rich neighborhood. They are able to lobby.
Not in my backyard.
You know, let's put it's in Ghana right now. There's the largest e-dump in the planet, and kids are burning plastic to get down to the heavy metals that I shouldn't say the heavy metals, the copper and stuff that's inside of these electronic devices, and they're getting cancer in the age of 20, 22. They're dying of cancer because they're burning highly carcinogenic plastic to get to these metals for less than $5 a day. And there are people shipping junk garbage from Australia to Ghana. And the reason why I'm saying this is not in my backyard.
Go to someone else.
Because in Australia, they have regulation, they have rules in place where you can't just dispose of electronic garbage in certain ways. Right. So they say, okay, it's very expensive to dispose of electronic garbage in Australia. So what do? You ship it. It's cheaper to pay to be shipped from Australia to Ghana than it is to pay for it to get done properly. So basically, that's an illustration of this impulse in humans. It's a very human. You don't have to go to God to derive this impulse.
Right.
I will do to. He says, "Do unto others as you have them do unto you." It's actually the opposite. It's like, do to others what you don't want them. This passage is commending the opposite ethic.
Do to others what you don't want.
Do to them. And he says it at the end of this passage, but don't deal with your own brothers ruthlessly.
Yeah.
So it's like he's telling us later, do unto others as you have them to do. But in this passage, there's a comma, but do to them. Don't do this to yourselves. Do to them what you wouldn't want them to do to you.
This is why some people would say it seems like we're dealing with, even if God is involved, two different gods. Because the God in the Old Testament seems to have an ethic that you don't find in the New Testament.
And where's our progressive revelation, guys? Where are you at? Raise your hand. Stand up. You know how they say, Brooklyn, stand up? Stand up. Like, stand up for yourselves. You're saying we got to read the lights and stuff and all of the stuff in early Genesis. We got to read that in light of later revelation, progressive. Okay, let's read this in light of progressive revelation. Why is it that in the New Testament you treat others like you would want to be treated, but here you're being told the exact opposite?
Yeah. And for the person that says, well, this was God showing us, whatever you would say to justify why this could be part of God's law, I think you have to take into account how God's law is characterized. In the Psalms, God's law is how you...
Psalm 119.
Right. This is how you keep your way pure. God's law is holy. God's law is just.
Right.
Moses even says, I think it's in Deuteronomy or one of in the Pentateuch, Moses said, when other nations hear our laws, they're going to say, what other nation has a God so great to give their people such laws as this? Like, these laws are being extolled in the scripture.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not
The law of the Lord is perfect.
right, perfect. They're not running from it saying, hopefully one day God gives us more progressive one.
Yeah. And they're not shying away from it and looking at it and trying to make excuses for misogyny. The law of the Lord is perfect.
Yeah.
There was a day where you said this with your chest out, but you can't do it now.
Right.
That's what this podcast is here to tell you. You can't do it now.
Right.
You may have been saying that you may have been quoting Psalm 119 with your chest out previously, but now look at this, comma, but don't do this to your brethren. Now say it with your chest out.
Amazing.
Yeah. 2 Samuel 24:1.
Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just to come in with this text. Again.
It's happening.
It's almost like what does this guy have, a temper? So we read this. I think we read this, and what the Israelites were supposed to get out of this is, I think this is some writer trying to get Israelites to internalize the reason why we're in such a bad state is because we kept angering our God. But I wonder if any of them ever stopped to think, why does our God keep getting so pissed off? Like, why is he in such a bad mood all the time?
No, Brady, I mean, clearly they're breaking his law. That's why he's angry.
So it's their fault.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No problem.
But again, the anger of the Lord is kindled against Israel. Like, I wonder to what degree, like, God would benefit from some anger management. You're sending plagues on your people.
Brady, I fear that your Facebook persona, the provocateur, is bleeding through.
I'm just saying, you're having your people take swords and go through the camp to kill everybody because they worship a calf, and I get it. You want to be worshipped, but damn, like, again, the anger of the Lord. I'm sorry, just saying that again. The anger of the Lord just made me think, like, chill, yo, like.
Well, some people would say he's unchanging, but his response, and because of his unchangeableness, when we change, we get the same response. And so we're messing up again. So I just anticipating the apologist's response. It's like, hey, it's not that God has changed his posture, it's that these people keep messing it up.
Yeah. Well, all I'm saying is just consider that maybe an ancient author speaking to his community wants them to internalize something about the anger of the Lord in the way that they've been living. And it's not necessarily just this, oh, there's this law. Maybe it's this, we don't like our state in the world.
Well,
We got to find a way to explain it to ourselves.
There's a good point to be made here about the way the New Testament, because when Christ heals the lame man, and he says, the man, I believe he was blind. It was the blind man. He was blind from birth. And it's like, well, who sinned? This man, and that mentality, even of Job's friends, that gets knocked in the text, is derivative from the principles you're taught in the text. Like these calamities, they overcome people because of sin in the text. Yeah. Often the calamity you're experiencing is tethered to a sin that you can directly attribute it to.
Right.
This is why they asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents? And he says, no, neither of them. This is just so that God could be glorified, and then he heals the man, right? But people will come at the people that were questioning, the interlocutors, and say, hey, why are they just so aloof to think that somebody has to have sin? Well, it's because the text, like it's because again in the text. When you look and you see a problem, then you can often see that's when we start seeing the etiology, the inherent etiology within the text. How often it's trying to explain naturalistic phenomena, and it's trying to give you a religious reason for it, a spiritual reason for it.
And then Jesus' response is like, you dummy. X, Y, and Z.
Why would you think that?
Why would you think anything different?
Yeah. And when the entire text is an etiology, the entire text is them trying to explain. It's neither of them, just so that God and then if they were savvy enough, they would say, well, God seems to get quite a bit of glory out of just calamity. It's not like he's more glorified by healing people. He's glorified in sex slavery, for crying out loud. Anyway.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
All right, okay. So 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go, number Israel and Judah.
Mm-hmm.
And then 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 1. Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel.
And so you see the same incident.
Yeah.
I paired those together so
Okay.
you could see that in the same incident, God's anger was kindled toward them, and he incited David to number them, right? In the other passage, Satan
incites David.
Yeah, so this will be a passage where...
And I think there's consequences for what he did.
Yeah.
When David numbers Israel, God's anger now judges Israel, and now God, he sends a plague. Is that how God does it?
Yeah. Now we were talking about the etiology. So clearly, at some point, they experienced the plague. Yeah. I mean, I guess we can deduce from this passage that maybe a plague was experienced, and they're trying to give an explanation. And the explanation, so David's the culprit, right? He's the person who did the wrong thing. Right. His punishment isn't on him; it's on Israel,
right? The nation.
And it's this. I remember talking to Brady at some point about this how the Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 passages where he says, visiting the sins of the fathers on their children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments, right? When he says that, it seems to be an etiology. It's showing you, okay, kid is born with cerebral palsy. The parents seem to be legit. They're God-fearing people. Their grandparents were God-fearing. Saying third and fourth generation is just far enough along that nobody knows what the F happened. But it's far enough in the past where you can say somebody back there messed up.
Somebody must have done something that we can't trace to.
Yeah, exactly.
So like we were talking about on the way here, right? We were talking about, we rode past a cemetery.
Yeah.
And we saw,
Exactly.
And you said,
After about 50 years,
After about 50 years, they put more bodies on top of those bodies.
because people stopped visiting the graves.
Yeah,
And it
people
doesn't
stop.
matter.
So it's almost like who would know, who would care, who's in that grave. Enough time has passed that, the generation. So in the same way, God they say God's going to send this judgment on the third and fourth generation, but by that time you can't really go back and
You can't trace what the person did, and so it ends up being an ideology for things that are wrong, and thus when people see the blind man,
Yeah.
they say, who sinned, him or his parents? So you see what I'm saying? The text is teaching you that the punishment for sin isn't necessarily visited upon the culprit. It sometimes is visited, at least in this case, the culprit being David. Instead, a plague is thousands of people have to die because David did something stupid.
But, and to the point that we're talking about here, the real culprit here is who, though?
Yeah.
Because in one passage, in the Second Samuel passage, God incites David.
Mm-hmm.
In the Chronicles passage, Satan incites David.
And the answer is yes.
Right. Well, here's the thing, and Let There Be Gaslight, I talk about this. I think what we don't often recognize is we capitalize Satan as if it's the devil character from the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the Old Testament, there is no standing Satan character.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, the angel of the Lord is called a Satan.
Like an adversary, yeah.
Yeah, Balaam is going in. His donkey stops and won't go any further. And the text says the angel of the Lord Sataned Balaam.
Mm-hmm.
Like so, even the angel of the Lord, capital Lord, is called a Satan in the Old
But
Testament.
your progressive revelation people say, well, what we didn't know then, we now know more clearly because we know we're not ignorant of his devices and so forth.
Yeah, but his devices would have to include the angel of the Lord in that case because he's a Satan.
Yeah.
Anyone who opposes can be a Satan. So I would say in 1 Chronicles 21, it could be that an ancient writer is trying to get God off the hook from 2 Samuel. It's like, oh, it wasn't God, it was an adversary. Or it could be the ancient writer saying, rather than say God, let me just say an adversary.
Yeah.
But if you know the story, you know that adversary is actually God.
Yeah. And either way, the result of this action is bad enough that we want to put a surrogate in place of God so that he is distanced like a mob boss.
Right, exactly.
And what we're saying, we have to restate the RICO case. That ain't flying in 2023.
Right.
Like there was a time when it was enough to, it was an angel, and then there was maybe another angel, and then it's like, okay, who's running?
Right.
Who the F is running?
So you get the lesser guy, if you can get the lesser guys to snitch on the one at the ball.
Let's give him the snitch.
Right. There's something going on here where if you could get some of these people at the lower level to say, no, actually, he told me to do.
It's actually we deal with him,
Right.
then we get to the root of the problem. Because if we can swap, we can keep swapping all day. He's the guy providing the cash for the operation.
There's a clip from the mob guys that we played at the beginning.
Yeah.
I want to get back to that piece, but let's go to one or two more biblical passages.
So Acts chapter 4, verse 26, the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his anointed.
Keep reading.
For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place.
There you go. So you have the culprits. This is another passage we could just read it just as evidence of what's going on here. This is yet another passage combining both ideas. And this is why theologians have had to try to come up with language and even borrow from philosophy to try to deal with it. That's the compatibilism is actually a philosophical term.
Wow.
And they're trying to grapple with the idea that in the self-same act, the scriptures are regularly presenting us. And it's because we know we have free acting individuals, and we know we have culpability, because in any religious situation you have damnation and you have redemption. So whenever you have that, but you also have the sovereignty of God, you're going to have, like I said, some terminal point, some terminus where they both meet, and you're going to have to find language to deal with it. Now, the text doesn't give us a fancy term like compatibilism, but theologians later give it to us because the theologians are trying to make sense of when these two worlds collide.
So I know we're trying to wrap this up, but this just brought up several other passages that I feel like we could really make the case stick, I think, if we look at some of these passages. So I'll run through them real quick. We don't even have to turn to them. You can if you want at home. Deuteronomy 32, right, is a famous passage where something's going on here in the text, where the Most High is dividing the nations up amongst some group of people. If you read, I think it's the Masoretic text, it says the Most High apportioned the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel. But if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Hebrew Bible, it's not the Most High divided the nations according to the sons of Israel. It's the Most High divided the nations according to the number of the sons of God, or according to the Elohim. And so some would say this is proof that as Israel got further and further away from polytheism, they didn't like the idea of the Most High dividing the nations amongst the gods, so they made it amongst the sons of Israel, which doesn't make sense. So there are people who so Michael Heiser, Mike Jones from Inspiring Philosophy, these guys would say, oh, no, it probably was the Most High dividing the nations amongst the sons of God. Now, critical scholars would say, but doesn't that suggest then that El Elyon, the Most High, is dividing the nations amongst his children, and Yahweh gets Israel as his portion, which makes Yahweh a God under El Elyon. So this is a point where if you want to get God off the hook for some things, you can say, oh, Yahweh isn't even the top boss. There's a God above him, El Elyon. If you say no, and what Michael Heiser and Michael Jones, two mics, what they say is, no. El Elyon is Yahweh. Here's how they try to get out of it. What they say is, El Elyon divided the nations, not amongst the sons of Israel. It really does say amongst the sons of God, the Elohim. But instead of him giving Israel to Yahweh, what the text is saying is, but he kept Israel for himself. He divided the nation amongst the sons of God, but kept Israel for himself. That's how they get out of that. They make El Elyon and Yahweh the same. That's something that can be debated. I think it is saying that El Elyon gave all his God, all the Elohim, the lower gods, he gave them each a nation, and he gave Yahweh Israel. That's what I think the text was saying. But if you get out of that and say, no, El Elyon is Yahweh. He just kept Israel for himself. He apportioned it to himself. Well, you get to Psalm 82. And now you have Yahweh calling the other gods in for accountability. This is the famous passage where I've said you are gods, but you'll die like men. And this is the passage where most would say, here's where Yahweh is actually ascending to become El Elyon.
I can see the Christian apologists already saying, Jesus already explained that in the New Testament. You see?
Even if he does, here goes the sticking point though. Let's just grant that Yahweh is telling these other gods, I said you're gods, but you'll die like men. He's judging these other gods. He's taking them down a notch. What Heiser and people like that would say is these other gods become the principalities and powers over all the other nations. And they would go as far as to say, so Zeus is a real deity. All the gods of all they're all real. Yahweh just is over them, and he dethrones them, but somehow they remain quasi in power. My question is, even if you allow that, if you say that, doesn't it still make Yahweh responsible for the fact that you have all these other nations worshiping all these other gods? How do you hold people responsible for worshiping the wrong God when you set them up? Even if we grant that you put them over these nations, aren't you now responsible for the idol worship of these other nations? Whose fault is it?
I mean, well, you're asking the big question, and that a person might ask who's a bit less theological. They just say, why create a world full of people and come to a small group of people and take tens of thousands of years even to get to people on the other side of the globe and just basically consign all of them and their descendants to hell. Essentially, I mean, this is the larger question.
Before you assign them to hell, though, you assign them to other gods.
Other gods, or you assign, or even if you say you turn them over to their own wicked hearts. I mean, it's the same big question. It's like you make a world full of. It's the opposite. No wonder why evangelicals are against climate, preservation of the planet and climate change. They're all for waste because apparently. God's all about wasting. It's like you make a whole mass of humanity, and the lion's share of them are going, hell haven't enlarged herself for them.
But there's something contradictory here. You claim you want them to worship you, even the masses.
Yeah, exactly.
But you give them other gods?
Well, you give them other gods, you turn... I'm just thinking the average evangelical is just running... There's like, what did Jesus say about that passage? Yeah. Jesus said... He said that the you are gods is a reference to us, right?
Right.
And that's what they say. They say that some of them, the exegetes will say that it's a reference to judges, to like higher up people. Right. And they'll say, if it was good enough for Jesus, I just wouldn't... Just for those people who aren't critical enough in their thinking to go that far, let's just articulate that we know what you think. Right. We know that you think Jesus, if it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. What Brady is articulating is a more in-depth. Yeah. It's similar to what I was talking to Brady and Albert about earlier today when we were discussing when Christ says about divorce that Moses gave it to you for the hardness of your heart. Mm-hmm. And when you go to the actual passage, who's giving it? Yahweh. But when Jesus modifies it and says Moses gave it to you for, now we got to run with that because of progressive revelation. And what you find is progressive revelation is just is an escape hatch. Yeah. It allows you to do in the New Testament whatever the heck you want to do with the Old Testament.
Whatever you need to do.
Whatever you need to do. Yeah, to escape your problems. You say, hey, I need to make Jesus fulfill this particular prophecy. Even if I have to make it elastic as heck for him to fill, I'll make it as elastic. I'll take a passage dealing with a virgin giving birth to us that doesn't necessarily require that this virgin be a person, actual virgin, as in the common vernacular, just a young woman. Yeah. But now, because I want to justify a virgin birth, a literal virgin birth, we're going to take that passage to justify. This is what the New Testament makes hash.
Wow.
And that seems to be the sub-theme here in this whole podcast. How the New Testament is regularly overturning. And some people say, the Sermon on the Mount, was that Matthew 5? Right? Matthew, that how it's turning, or is it Matthew 7?
Matthew 5 is the Beatitudes, isn't it?
Yes, the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5. How it's regularly overturning what people thought. But it's not only often, I won't say just the Sermon on the Mount, not only often is the New Testament overturning misreadings of those, it's actually overturning the ethics. So, see, understand this. I'm saying so much, I'm sorry. But it's like the New Testament doesn't just overturn misreadings and misunderstandings of the Old Testament. Often it's actually overturning the actual thoughts of the Old Testament. You see what I mean? Like the whole do unto others as you would have them is overturning. Don't treat them like
Well, so I talk about this in the book. There are people who would say there's no way that Christianity would have got off the ground or that Judaism would have spread if someone like the authors of the New Testament had not come to redefine Yahweh and make him more palatable. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, I think that overturning, it was a necessary maneuver.
Yeah. And they're doing it today.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about that, how the Christians they're trying to make it fit with evolution and stuff. Right. And after, the question is, at what point, you, Christian, are you going to just say, all right, enough's enough? I mean, I'm just basically making my own version of a religion. I don't need these artifacts of something so barbaric.
Something that needs to be updated so often.
Yes. It reminds you of the updates on your computers. It's like as soon as you get used to the new one, now you got to, it's like, all right, as science uncovers another one, it's like, all right, I'm going to have to update this. I got to make sure that it's in keeping with this. It's like, at what point do you realize, at what point have the updates turned it into something that is entirely different than what it was?
And the whole dispensationalist, right, like rubric and how they see things is some of them out there might be kind of coming back and saying, well, yeah, so this is why we believe in the structure of the New and Old Testament in this way. But I think what we're also talking about is the historical nature that explains this away much better than these supposed convoluted structures of coherence, right? Internal coherence that you were talking about earlier in another episode. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's an interesting way to tie this in, though.
Right.
Because you do have that. I got so far away from that so many years ago that I forgot about that.
With the
Dispensationalism, just this continual, what is it, 7 stages? Like seven stages of here's what God was doing then, and here's what God was doing then. That's closer to parsimony than what a lot of people do. But I think it's what you have to do because you do see this shifting in the narrative.
Yeah. What you're watching, I mean, we did a whole evolution episode, and you see in the text, I mean, it's clear there that there's an evolution of a particular religion.
Yeah.
And eventually the latter version of it, somewhat, it ends up bearing somehow they end up losing the polytheism pretty early on. And then the latter iteration kind of returns back with the Trinitarian.
Right.
Thing.
I never thought of it that way. That's right.
So, but it just evolves, and it seems to. It's kind of interesting.
Do you want to do this last passage here? 1 Kings 22:19 through 22.
And Micaiah said, "Therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, By what means? And he said, I will go out, and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all prophets. And he said, You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so.
When we mentioned this earlier, you said this is a. I mean, we've kind of hashed out all of these ideas already, but here you can just see like he's admitting he's lying. All right, not the Lord, not Yahweh, but this lying spirit. He gets the head nod from the mob boss and says, "All right, you go ahead, and I'm going to give you the cash to make it happen." So I wanted to trade out certain terminology, but let's just put a gun. He's like, let's change the lie to a murder, a hit. All right, who's going to perform this hit? And a couple people come up with their ideas. Okay, I'm going to put a bomb in his car. The other guy says, I'll flatten his tire and make sure that he goes off the bridge when he's on the freeway or whatever. And the other guy says, all right, I'm going to take my shotgun and I'll put, a couple bullets into his head and in his chest to make sure. He said, I like that idea. Okay, I'm going to give you the cash to make sure that it happens. And you go out and you put the bullet. I want a bullet through his chest and I want a bullet to the head. And he says, you go out, you're going to succeed. Here's the money to go do it. Now, that guy goes out and he does what he says. He does what Yahweh said. Is he guilty? Yes, he's guilty. In our current legal system, do we go after Yahweh, the mob boss? What do you guys think? You think we should go after, should we just stop at the guy who pulled the trigger?
Well, like Giuliani said, right? If you have an enterprise, when you have a succession. But like Giuliani said, right?
Yeah.
If you have, this is not just a conspiracy.
Yes.
Right. This is
an agreement,
and that happens over a long millennia, I guess, right? Through the course of history. So.
But what do you? I mean, is he culpable in the system?
He swings the axe. He gives the green light. He tells the lying prophet, "You'll be successful. Go and do it."
Right.
I mean, he's giving them the cash.
He's providing them with what they need. He gives the command to go in and take the young virgins for yourself.
Yeah.
Kill everybody.
But there's a surrogate, so his hands are clean. He didn't go. He's chilling in Sal's pizzeria eating his lasagna. He just gave the guy the cat. The hitman came in. He gave him a discreet package, and he went off and did the deed. Is he guilty? He didn't do it. He sent the other guy to do it. Think about it. He could have went himself, but he sent somebody else to do it to keep his hands clean.
Well, let's You mentioned Job several times.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Who's at fault for the death of Job's children and for the destruction of Job's property?
You got better looking ones at the end. I mean, who cares?
It's all about beauty at the end of the
It's
day.
all about beauty.
So Satan meant it for evil, but God meant it for
You know what I
good
mean?
to
Give them
give
better
them
looking
better
kids,
looking
right?
children.
Yeah.
Have you considered my servant Job?
Mm-hmm.
He put the battery in Satan's back. Even if we say Satan is the one
Yeah.
who took Job's family and took Job's health, Satan wasn't looking at Job.
Yeah.
Have you considered my servant Job?
And Satan's like, hey, actually, I haven't. Actually, I haven't.
Now that you mention it,
Mention it. Let me go on over there and see what's going on. That caused some mischief.
you can do this, this, and this. You just can't take his
Can't
life.
Can't touch him.
Can't touch him,
Yeah.
and then can't take his life.
And
You
you see,
can-
you see, this is the other thing. The main character. I was proposing this to you a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
The main character phenomenon in the Bible, because you have these main characters like David. He sins. He's the main character, just like in the movie. He's the protagonist. All these other people die, and nobody cares. But you don't want the main character to die. Job, main character. His kids die.
Right.
What is a tornado comes levels the house they're having a party in.
It's like The Simpsons, man.
You know, it's just like, but long as you can touch everybody, don't touch Job because he's the main character. And I think there's a sense in which when a person reads a story like that, they put themselves in the seat of the main
That's
character.
what, that's what protagonists.
That's the purpose.
You
of it.
attach yourself to the protagonist,
Yes. Yeah.
and the Bible presents Israel as a protagonist, so you attach yourselves to them.
Yeah.
You don't give a shit about what happens.
All of the genocide.
Genocide. You attach yourself to David. You,
Yeah.
Like me, I didn't care about Bathsheba.
Yeah,
She wasn't one of me,
exactly.
right?
Until your mom says, "Well, I always thought the same."
Right, right.
Yeah.
So it's just like you said, yeah, the main character, the protagonist, not just the main character, the protagonist.
Yes.
You attach yourselves to these people so that now your view about the others,
Yeah.
they're not round characters in your
Yeah.
eye.
Yeah. It's not a filled out movie. It's like, it's like freaking Steven Seagal going in there and beating up all them Jamaicans. They're just mop heads that he can just break. You know what I mean? Like it has nothing. They have families. They're left there. They're all crippled and maimed. Their arms twisted. Nobody cares about them because the whole point is Steven Seagal goes in there
Right.
and he walks out unscathed.
Yeah. Right.
And that's what's going on in the text. Job, he's my main guy. His kids, they can die. I'll do you one better. I'll give you some better looking kids. Right? That's the nature of the logic of the text.
This is why I like Dark Matter 25:25 because what he did was he showed you how Yahweh has been a main character.
Yeah.
But then he zooms the camera lens back and says, what if Yahweh is just a character
Yeah, and another
messing up everybody else's timeline?
Right.
You know what I mean?
It's one of the revelations that got me to leave the faith because I remember at the start of Exodus they present Pharaoh as a bad guy to the Israelite, and you've qualified. You've caught me up to this. You said, "Hey, genocide wasn't inherently wrong. It's genocide against your people that you're not feeling." Well, needless to say, when you read the beginning of Exodus, you see Pharaoh. He's killing babies. He's killing Israelite babies.
Right.
You're like, this is a bad guy. Who kills babies? By the end, by Joshua, Israel is killing babies. But you're already sold on the story.
Right.
You're like, this is the protagonist. I'm with them. It's
They can do what I wouldn't want. The antagonist.
Yeah, it's like there are all these movies. I remember there was one back in the day with Clint Eastwood, and it was like I think he was a bank robber or something like that. You got these people where they're the bank robber, and you're on their side because they introduce. If that's the character you're introduced to, that's the one you want to see succeed. And you find yourself by the end of the movie, you're like, ooh, these guys killing and burning.
This is why when people talk to me about, but the Bible is the Word of God, and the Bible is this, and the Bible is that, I say the Bible is ancient propaganda.
Yeah.
This is people who they wanted the readers to be on their side.
Yeah,
they wanted the
exactly.
readers to feel like we have a just cause.
Like you don't tell the side of the story of the Hivites, the Amorites, the Perizzites,
Edomites.
the Edomite. You don't tell their. If you told their stories, we would empathize with them. Why? Because we're human beings.
Right.
You will see you'll be in the delivery room seeing that Amorite baby being born, and it wouldn't be so easy for you to just see it getting cut asunder by an Israelite sword.
Yeah.
But if you round them off, if you don't round them off and flatten them as characters, and then they're just some vague enemy, This is the problem. This is why people say it buttresses racism and bigotry. Because when you do that to any people, when you do it to black people, when you do it to Koreans, when you do it to white people, it makes it easy to dehumanize them. And this is the reason why slavery is bad. This is the reason why we need to be dealing with other people, because they're born of a woman just like we are. You know, that's the way to develop your ethics. You don't develop some main character ethic and then you can treat everybody else like some expletive. You know what I mean? You want to.
No, I'm feeling you. Let's conclude here then.
Mm-hmm.
You have a point here where you say compatibilism, this idea of trying to reconcile free will with God's sovereignty.
Yeah.
You say compatibilism is a subcategory of theodicy.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you mean there, Aldo? I want to see if you have any feedback to this comment.
I mean, that's just complex language to say that theodicy is the larger category that compatibilism falls in under. Theodicy is basically the theological apologetic for evil existing when you have a sovereign, omnibenevolent, or all good God. Mm-hmm. How do you explain evil, the problem of evil? Well, theodicy is just the large category of all of the subcategories of.
I mean, it inevitably gets to that question of theodicy when you really try to tease it out.
It's the larger category, and whenever we talked about this earlier, when you have certain attributes independently, I talked about this when I talked about the train wreck in Palestine, Ohio, how independently you don't have a catastrophe, but when you have this crash and then certain things start mixing together, you end up having all of these real big problems, because you talk about God's omnibenevolence and in and of itself, you don't have a problem, you don't have a dilemma. You talk about God's sovereignty in and of itself, you don't have a dilemma.
Yeah.
You talk about God's his lovingness, like his love, you don't have a problem. But then when you start talking about other attributes of God, you find yourself clashing with those. Like, how do I uphold this? Then theologians have to do the work, the logical work, to try to make sense of that. And that's where you get compatibilism. You're trying to make sense. It doesn't really make sense of it. I think what we see here, we're putting compatibilism on trial. The RICO trial is really a trial of this actual theological category. It's saying that this isn't a reality. This doesn't exist.
I also see this RICO case being, when it comes to those abstract theological concepts, it's really also bringing history, right? Seeing things, making, if Christians want to talk about Christianity being a historical religion, then we're going to take that. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to take that as seriously as we can. But bringing in all of the analogies that we've just done for the last, couple hours, right? Like, there are much better human explanations for all the pronouncements that are made, right? It's constantly, what we're seeing is God making all these pronouncements all the time, right? He's a big talker, right? And he's like, it's all talk, and he acts, but he acts in ways that don't comport with how he talks, and other ways he does, but
Clearly it's a he, though.
Clearly it's a he, right? Clearly it's a he. We can extract the sex and gender aspect of all of this.
It's not all about headship either. At least not that.
Right, not that head. Exactly. Yeah.
We should admit there's a mafia, because belonging to an organization, as long as you put it forward, like the Ku Klux Klan and so many other different weird organizations, it's not illegal. It's your actions that are illegal within that group. So you can be, he said, we could say that all of the old timers who are bosses, and admit he's a boss, he's an underboss, he's this, but we don't do anything wrong, and we're good guys. Now you got to prove that he did something personally, not just this RICO law that they invented and everybody can get caught up in it. They have somebody taking the stand, this is the mafia, the boss has got to okay this hit. Even if he didn't, he sucked into it. And that was all successful. They used different equipment, bugs and tapes that were phenomenal.
I just want to say, like, can you imagine if you bugged Heaven's office? Like, all the things that have happened, like, if the Bible is true and God's swinging this axe here and he's using this nation to do this and he's using this person to do this and judge this person, and oh, I used you to judge them, but I'm going to judge you for. Can you imagine what kind of shit you could pin on the God of the Bible if you bugged his office? But here's the thing that they said in that clip. Before the RICO, if I'm a boss and I give a green light to you and you commission him to do a job, the cops can catch him. He says RICO made it so they can rope us all in, but we're good guys, right? Before RICO, we loved it because if this guy commits a crime or he does something that we don't like, we can just say he's not part of our family.
Yeah.
He's not part of our organization. He did that on his own.
Yeah.
But RICO, now you're going to represent. And I think there's something to, even today with Christians, people of any religion, when somebody takes something in their holy text too literally and lives it out, and it ends up causing some kind of pain, you say something against LGBT community because the Bible told you that that's how God feels.
Right.
But you say, no, he doesn't represent all Christians. He's not part of our family. He's not part of our
Trying to split it up. They're trying to split it up.
Don't RICO us.
Yeah.
That's just, he's an outlier.
Yeah.
She's not really one of us.
Really? Yeah.
But RICO says, no. If this is part of you all's code of conduct, and this comes down from the top, your organization is guilty of this.
We're locking all of you.
That's brilliant.
Yeah. The jihadist, the bigot, the religious fanatic, it's
the same criminal organization.
the same organization.
Yeah. So I say we got a case.
I think the
so.
case has been made.
I think we got a case.
You tell us, what do you think? Viewer, watcher, critic, how do you absolve God of these charges? Is he free and clear?